Good evening, and welcome to tonight's History Theory of New Media lecture. My name is Abigail DeKosnick, and I'm an associate professor here in the Berkeley Center for New Media and also in the Department of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies. I'd like to thank the Berkeley Center for New Media and the Citrus Policy Lab for co-sponsoring tonight's event. I am the co-organizer of a working group called The Color of New Media, sponsored by the Center for Race and Gender, and The Color of New Media focuses on the intersections of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and nation with new media studies. And by the way, let me just announce that our working group's first book, #Identity, is coming out next month from University of Michigan Press. It will also be out as an open access book too, so everybody can read it. And it's full of essays and interviews by members of our working group, and it focuses on how people of color and LGBTQIA people and non-American people interact and perform and do politics on Twitter. So that's what #Identity is about. Please keep an eye out for that. So in The Color of New Media, our core foundational question is the color of new media studies white? Because it can seem that way when you survey how emerging technologies are widely discussed as produced by white male inventors, or made by predominantly white and male tech companies, or in relation to majority white users. So our working group strives to center groups of makers and users that are often at the margins of discussions of quote-unquote high technologies. And thus, we find Dr. Noble's work to be an important, significant, powerful intervention in new media studies. So now I will introduce Dr. Safiya Noble. Dr. Noble is currently visiting at the University of Southern California's Annenberg School of Communication and is on the faculty of the Department of Information Studies in the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA, and she will be founding this fall the Center for Critical Internet Inquiry at UCLA. She is the author of a best-selling book on racist and sexist algorithmic bias in commercial search engines, which you all know, I'm sure, which is entitled Algorithms of Oppression: How Search Engines Reinforce Racism, published by NYU Press. And she was the recipient of the Hellman Fellowship and the UCLA Early Career Award. She is regularly quoted for her expertise by national and international press on issues of algorithmic discrimination and technology bias, including by The Guardian, the BBC, CNN International, USA Today, Wired, Time, and the New York Times, to name just a few. And she will also be appearing on tonight's episode of Full Frontal with Samantha Bee. So if you have a chance to watch her on tonight's episode, please keep an eye out for her. After Dr. Noble's lecture, we will be excited to receive questions from the audience. So please write your questions down on the note cards that we hope you picked up on the way in. You'll also have a chance to raise your hands right after the lecture and receive a blank note card in case you didn't get one. And we will collect them right after the lecture, and I will select a few questions, or as many questions as we have time for, to read during the Q&A session. So please join me now in welcoming Dr. Safiya Umoja Noble.
Everybody's getting extra credit for being here tonight, right? Is that right? Yeah. I know. It's such a thrill to be here. Berkeley's one of my favorite places. I grew up in Fresno. I'm a native Californian. I lived in Oakland for 13 years at Lake Merritt. I was walking, in fact, earlier today with Professor Salahi through the campus, and I was like, it's like the telegraph is frozen in time in a certain kind of way, and I used to spend a lot of my youth here, and now I'm just a super old lady, and I was completely winded walking, so it's fine. But I am happy to be here and to see some old friends and new. And tonight I'm gonna give a shorter kind of talk than maybe typical, so that we have plenty of time to have conversation and also leave some room for your brilliant ideas to be added to the mix. So normally I would kind of give you many more examples that are from the book, but tonight I'm just going to try to hit you with some headlines, and I think it will crack open enough of a conversation for us to have about algorithms. And let me just say one other thing before we kind of jump in tonight, which is it's really fascinating to see this many people come out and want to think about the issues of discrimination and oppression as they intersect with various technologies. Just 10 years ago, and this is just a note for the students here tonight, it was about 10 years ago that I went back to graduate school, and I had left the marketing and advertising industry, and I was thinking about all of the ways in which we were starting to use the internet. Now, I have been on the internet since the late 80s, before the graphic user interface. I remember getting an email, in fact, I want to say it about like 1989 or 90 from my friends in the National Society of Black Engineers. And I remember saying, who would ever want to sit at their computer and type all day when you could just pick up the phone? So don't take any tech investment advice from me. That's the first tip. But I remember as I was starting graduate school how everyone was thinking about search engines. Now this is at a time when pre-search engines, many of us were kind of moving through these complex decision trees. You might pop into a chat room and ask, does anybody know anything about X? And try to find an expert. That you kind of understood that the rules of engagement were highly subjective. And you were going to get what you were going to get. And then search engines came about, and as I was leaving the advertising industry, we were spending a lot of time starting to think about how we could optimize our clients' products and services in search engines. About 40% of our media buying budgets were moving from traditional mass media, out-of-home, radio, television, print, to online advertising. And these like extra special people who were computer programmers would show up and work in ad agencies and tell us how they could optimize content. And it was an exciting time, but it was a bit of a shock to leave in the mid-2000s, early 2000s, like 2005, 6, and go to graduate school and see everyone talking about search engines like they were kind of the new public library. And that Google would be this amazing new technology that was starting to come on. By 2009, most people in big library and information schools were starting to either be energized at the thought of Google. There were big academic libraries who were digitizing their books with the Google Book Digitization Project, and others who were really alarmed at what search engines would mean in terms of changing the future of knowledge and access to knowledge. So that's the moment that I entered graduate school. And I remember as I was thinking and trying to put together a dissertation committee, I would say, I really think that these systems can be gamed, and not only can they be gamed, and part of that was because I just left advertising, but not only did I know that they could be gamed, I felt that there was evidence of kind of racist bias and kind of sexist bias and discrimination that was happening with these technologies. And then it was very difficult to find 4 people who would be on a dissertation committee in 2010 that would be willing to put their name on the line and say, we think that technology can discriminate, or that algorithms can discriminate. In fact, what most people were saying at that time was that it's just math, and code can't discriminate. And that was the dominant discourse. And so I remember not only trying to make the case, but being among some of the people who, in some ways, I think took a lot of body blows for trying to argue that there, in fact, can be racist and sexist bias in our technology platforms. And yet, here we are today, where everyone's talking about algorithms, and everyone's talking about the ways in which algorithms can discriminate. And I always love to think in my mind, in my fantasies, that I was a part of 2017 being the year we fell out of love with algorithms. I don't know, that's like my own thing that I dreamed that maybe that I had a fingerprint on that. But this idea now has started to shift into a new direction. And some of you might be here because you're interested in these kind of sets of concerns about the impact of new and emerging technologies on society. And this idea of kind of that where technology touches society and where society is touching technology, and that they're not, in fact, mutually exclusive, seems to be common sense now in some ways. I remember, in fact, when I was writing the book for NYU Press, my editor, I said, you know, I want to name this book Algorithms of Repression, and she said, Safiya, no one knows what an algorithm is. And so that tells you two things. One, that we've come a long way, and two, it takes a long time to write an academic book. And so I said, trust me, by the time we get there, everyone's going to know. And so here we are. So I'm going to share with you a few examples that are in the book. And again, these I think can open up some interesting conversations for us tonight. All right, so here's one of the first examples that you might have seen happen. This was a couple of years ago. DeRay McKesson, who is kind of loosely associated with the Black Lives Matter movement, he tweeted out, and you know, he kind of rose to prominence online on Twitter. If you're on Twitter, you might know him. After Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, and he was very active on Twitter. He mostly became well known there because Beyonce followed him, and so I always feel obligated to say in all of my talks that if anybody here knows Beyonce and you could get her to follow me, I feel like it would really amplify the work. All the Beyonces, I will retweet you to, so here's DeRay, and he tweets out, if you Google map the N-word house, this is what you'll find, America. And what was happening at that time is that during that week, if you did a search on the N-word house or the N-word king, this was during the administration, the presidency of Barack Obama, Google Maps would take you to the White House. So the N-word house became synonymous with the White House that President Barack Obama lived in. And the response to this was actually quite telling. So there's a couple things that happened. First, Google's interviewed about it, and they say some inappropriate results are surfacing in Google Maps. It should not be. We apologize for any offense this may have caused. I think weirdly as if like maybe only one or two people could be offended by the thought of this. So it's a weird kind of non-apology apology. I always joke with my husband that when he says things like, I'm sorry if you're offended, I don't really feel apologized to, but maybe that's just me. I don't think so. And then the more important part of their kind of statement is our teams are working to fix this issue quickly. Now this is a very typical kind of Silicon Valley response, which is there's a glitch in an otherwise perfect operating system. And we're going to get the system back online, or we're going to fix this temporary problem. But what happens is that if you start to look in a more systematic way over time, which is what I tried to do in writing the book, you see that there comes to be quite a mountain of evidence, in fact, to show that those glitches, so to speak, tend to always be pointed toward these kinds of leakage, seepages of racist and kind of sexist ideas. Here's Kabir Ali. You might remember him. He's a teenager from Baltimore. These are screenshots of a video that went viral on Twitter. Kabir is doing a search on the keywords 3 black teenagers. And when he does the keyword search in Google Images on 3 black teenagers, he gets what you can see here, these kind of criminalized mugshots of young black teens, mostly men or young boys. And then he says, let's see what happens if we change one word from black to white. And then he's like, yo, look at this. And of course you can see here's the way in which 3 white teenagers gets characterized in Google image search, which is always really strange to me because it's like this perfectly curated Getty image type of imaginary of white teenagerdom. And you guys, I had white friends when I was a teen, and that's not what was going down. Okay? I know. Also, multiple sports being played at one time. I know there's like a lot going on in these images that won my question. And so, you know, Jessica Gwynn, who is the tech reporter, she's a tech editor for USA Today, did a great story about this and kind of interrogating, again, what does it mean? And one of the things that I think is interesting here is the way in which platforms platforms kind of curate a particular set of symbols in our society that point to a type of reality and non-reality. So here in the case of 3 black teenagers, this is presented as a particular kind of reality, and yet non-reality about white teenagerdom is actually much more kind of manufactured, and I find this incredibly interesting, and we can talk about this tonight too if you want. The next day, at Bob's Burgers guy, he notices that Google has quietly, in this case, now it's not issued a public statement, it's just quietly tweaked the algorithm to include one image of a white teenage boy who has somehow now this is validating, if you read this closely, and this is one of the things that's so valuable about like a media studies or a humanities or social science kind of training when you're looking at and trying to study these artifacts of the internet. What we're doing here is naturalizing the idea that the African Americans were in fact criminals, and then just bringing over an idea that one white teenage boy could also be a criminal. What's really disturbing in particular about this young man is this is Durley Paul Desmond, who was sentenced to 50 years in a federal prison after pleading guilty to the capital murder of John Craig Anderson in Jackson, Mississippi in 2011. He basically murdered in a vicious hate crime an African American man. And so if you know what this image is, you also have this type of interesting way in which the most extreme version of kind of criminality gets depicted here. And I find this interesting. On the other side, you know, we've thrown in a few girls playing volleyball or something as like a church youth group. But again, you know, the dominant narrative here is still standing. Now, this was the study that really launched the book. And what I did was kind of back in 2009, I started looking at what happens when you look for various identities in search engines. So I looked at just a combinations of keywords about identities that were kind of in our common vernacular. I used the census categories, and then I paired them with boys, girls, men, women, and really not to reinforce a particular kind of gender binary, but really to kind of think about in the typical ways that we are forced to conceive of race and ethnicity and gender in like public forms, or the ways in which we kind of enroll for public services. These are the types of categories that are available to us. And what I found is that from 2009 all the way through until 2012, so for many years there, when you did a keyword search on black girls, Asian girls, Latina girls, the first page was almost exclusively pornography. And you didn't have to add the word sex, you didn't have to add the word porn. Girls of color just were synonymous with hypersexualization and pornography. And on this page here, this is 2011, first you have a porn site followed by the Black Girls, which is a UK band of white guys who call themselves the Black Girls. Does anybody know them? It's like, even when I'm in the UK, I'm like, you guys know the Black Girls? And they're like, we've never heard of them. So here we have the band who's excellent at search engine optimization, terrible at music distribution, and all right. Followed by a porn site, a chat site that's kind of a gateway to porn, the Black Girls, the UK band, Facebook page, winning. Followed by a porn site and then a blog. All right, and so I wrote about this for kind of a feminist magazine, Bitch magazine, and then wrote kind of a piece. And one of the things that's been so interesting over the years talking about this, you know, I can remember the first time I was a graduate student presenting this work at a conference in like 2010. And 11, and being met, first of all, you know, I would go into these spaces, it's so exciting to look out at all of you. I would go to conferences in the kind of internet studies spaces, and I'd be the only black person, and for sure the only black woman, and there might be like 3 other women of color there, and you know, 2 of them were gay, and we were like multiple identities, you know, happening, like checking all the boxes. And people would say, would stand up to me and say, well, maybe black girls just do more porn. This was the response, even though now we would never conceptualize that. We just go of course something's not right here. But the prevailing ideas about the kind of veracity or the credibility and the truthfulness of what we find in search engines has been with us for some time, and we're really just starting to pull back some of the edges around that. All right, now one of the reasons why I think, in the book I advocate very strongly for interdisciplinary work. Now here's the thing, how many of you consider yourself doing interdisciplinary work? Okay, about half of you. All right, so here's the pro tip for people interested in interdisciplinary work. What it usually means is that you will be conversant with multiple fields, and they will not be conversant back with you. So when I would go into, for example, I was at the information school at Illinois, which is where I got my master's and my PhD, and I would come into a graduate student workshop and start talking about my work, and I would start to say, well, let's historicize why it is that we find black girls becoming synonymous with pornography or hypersexualized content. And then I would give a black feminist historical analysis of the ways that for 300 years, the tropes about the hypersexualization of black women and girls has been in circulation in contemporary American society because it's been used as a mechanism for oppression and not distributing resources, quite frankly, to black women. In fact, I give this kind of history of how, did I do that? I don't know exactly. I never know. It's okay. I've done that so many times, it's really I would give this kind of history of how, for example, there are many different racist and kind of sexist stereotypes that circulate in our society. In one particular case of this kind of idea of the Jezebel whore or the hypersexualized black girl, this becomes a really powerful trope that gets invented kind of at the historical moment when the transatlantic slave trade is made illegal. So when you have the transatlantic slave trade that's made illegal, the only way in the United States, in the Americas, North and South America, in particular North America, that you can reproduce the enslaved population is how? I already gave you the key word. Reproduce. When black women give birth to their children, they are born enslaved. And so you must manufacture in the society a stereotype that says black women want to have a lot of kids. They're hypersexual. It's not our fault that we have a rapidly growing enslaved population through forced, in many cases, reproduction of this labor force. So this is how interdisciplinarity is really important and valuable, because before you bring these types of analysis, there's the argument that, well, it's a glitch in the system. But that's insufficient when you start thinking about a history of oppression, a history of discrimination and marginalization. And so a really great resource for you here is the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia. I recommend you just go check it out. All right, now, every academic has one slide with too many words. That's this one, okay? We're gonna get through it together, which means take a picture of it if you care about it, and then I'm gonna move on, all right? What I want you to know is that there are multiple theories that I'm really working through in this book, and that I'm putting into conversation. And one of the things that I can tell you is that when I was in information school, talking about, now everyone's taking a picture, don't put it on the internet, you guys, this is private, it's between us. I'm just like, talking about the internet. One of the things that would happen is I would walk into meetings with, let's say, computer scientists, or colleagues who were trained in engineering, and I would say, well, what happens if we posit that these search results are linked to a kind of racist and sexist history in the United States? And we can do that if we use something like black feminism, for example, as a lens to unpack and make sense of what these search engine results mean. People would say things like, what is black feminism? So this is the gift I'm giving you for those of you doing interdisciplinary work, is that you will be met many times with people who are specialists in one area and who will not understand these other frameworks, sociological frameworks, science and technology studies frameworks, philosophy frameworks, critical race theory frameworks, feminist theory that you're bringing. And I just say stay with it, because what you'll find is that over time you will shift the field, and certainly it's become an amazing new phenomenon to look out at a crowd as diverse as us and have these kinds of conversations and see so many people interested in these conversations. So these are people that you can read, and these are the theoretical frameworks that I put into conversation in my work. All right, so quickly, because I want to give us some time to talk. All right, we have, prior to the 2016 presidential election, and I'll tell you that for many years I was talking about the gamification of search and the power relations that were embedded in it, and the ways in which misinformation and disinformation flourish in these platforms, and that they really should not come to be a replacement for teachers, libraries, knowledge. It was interesting because those same logics then were at play during the 2016 presidential election. But here's what we know. In 2013, 3 years prior, there was a really important study done by Epstein and Robertson. And they found that, they argued that democracy was at risk because manipulating search rankings could shift voters' preferences substantially without their awareness. They did a controlled study. When people weren't really sure how they felt about a candidate, they would do these kind of controlled searches where people thought they were looking up information about someone. If they got negative information about that candidate, they said, we won't vote for that person. And if they got positive, this is all about the front page. And of course, the front page is the most important real estate. I know most of you click through to like page 23,000, but no one else outside of us in this room is doing that, all right? So the front page is really, really important because most people don't go past what's on the first page of search results. And I know this is not true, again, for anyone in here because most of you never write your papers, for example, for your classes from what you find on the first page of search results. I'm not looking at anyone specifically, but I think you know who you are. All right, so this is my warning to tell you to stop it. All right, I just did a solid for all your professors who are here. All right, so Epstein and Robertson, they say search engines should be regulated because they are really a threat to democracy. That the way in which search engine results can be manipulated is something we have to pay attention to. And they were, the people who've been thinking and talking for quite some time about search engine regulation and more broadly, internet platform regulation have not been popular people, myself included. And now here we have in the mainstream conversations about regulation. Of course, part of that is because we see so many more products that are coming online, and they're coming I think in direct relationship to tragedies, to genocide, to mass murder, to suicides, things that are really profound and have a profound impact in our society. It's been interesting to me just in the past, few days with the, white nationalist murder of Muslims in New Zealand, and seeing how the incredible effort now and almost kind of cottage industry of making visible hate online. And of course, if you're interested in this, there's whole new fields that are emerging, people who you can work with and study with. I think about people like Joe Donovan, who was at Data and Society, who's now at Harvard at the Kennedy School. And others who have really been thinking about what does it mean to game these systems in the interest of kind of the most painful and heinous kinds of acts that we could witness. Even in the case, I think about Facebook Live. Would we have known about the product Facebook Live had it not been used to document the death of Philandro Castile by his girlfriend, Denman Reynolds. I mean, that is how people came to even understand that that product existed. So think about this kind of commercial relationship between tragedy and pain in our society, and the ways in which some of these products are boosted and circulate. Now, immediately following the 2016 presidential election, this story got a lot of traction. This is the week following the 2016 election. When you did a search on final election results, it took you to a disinformation site that reported out that Donald Trump won the popular vote. So no matter how you voted, that's a lie. It's not even an alternative fact. It's just not, it's like not the truth. We know that he won the Electoral College, but did not win the popular vote. And yet, we wonder, what does it mean when people are constantly engaging with search engines like fact checkers? And these are the kinds of things that I really try to bring up in my work about the politics of these spaces. When Sergey Brin is asked about these issues of kind of the hijacking, so to speak, of results, which often takes place by white nationalists and white power organizations, when he's asked about the adjusting the algorithm, this always kills me. Sometimes I can't read it without laughing. He says, when they're asking him about adjusting the algorithm to keep this kind of like white supremacy from reaching the top results, he says that would be, quote, bad technology practice. An important part of our values as a company is that we don't edit the search results. Where instead, what our algorithms produce, whether we like it or not, are the search results. I think people want to know we have unbiased search results. Except for when we're in Germany and France, and it's against the law to traffic in hate crime, hate information, racist propaganda, anti-Semitism. So see, there's an interesting set of discourses that play out around the world depending on where you're using these technologies. And I think this is another important part of thinking about what's at stake. In the US, we have a very different framework than other places that have a much closer, intimate relationship with things like the Holocaust and genocide, where there's a real clear understanding in a policy framework that the circulation of anti-Jewish, kind of anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, anti-gay, anti-queer, anti-black propaganda can actually lead to really harmful outcomes like the Holocaust. And we have less of a reckoning and less of a kind of an acknowledgement of the relationship between speech and content, and that I think we're all witnessing every day in the news that we are coming rapidly towards some type of reconciliation that we're going to have to work through on that. I won't spend any time here. I'll just say quickly that in the book I wrote quite a bit about Dylan Roof. This isn't Dylan Roof. But I wrote about this for Time Magazine as well, and kind of what's at stake when young people in particular are highly reliant upon internet platforms, in particular search engines, to do sense-making of their world. We know in the case, for example, of Dylan Roof, that one of the things that came forward in his online diary, his manifesto, was that he went to Google and he typed the words black on white crime into the search engine, which really led him down a rabbit hole of white supremacist websites. The Council of Conservative Citizens, if you don't know, was the first site that he came to. The Southern Poverty Law Center characterizes the CCC as vehemently racist. That's how they characterize them. You can see in Dylan Roof's own words that one of the things he was trying to do was go to a search engine to make sense of the reporting on the George Zimmerman trial. So if you don't recall, George Zimmerman was on trial for killing Trayvon Martin, and this was a major national news story in the US. All the polls that were being taken around how the public felt about the outcome of the Zimmerman trial, while Zimmerman was on trial, African Americans overwhelmingly reporting out Zimmerman was guilty and he should be put in prison. White Americans overwhelmingly reporting out he's innocent and should be acquitted. And so here we have Dylan Roof in his own words saying he's trying to make sense of this reporting. He goes to the Wikipedia, and then he, more importantly, Googles a racist red herring, quite frankly, because we know that black on white crime is actually a red herring that gets used in white nationalist organizations. As he goes on and talks about his deep research, in the end he says, from here I found out about the Jewish problem and other issues facing our race, and I can say today that I'm completely racially aware. So, you know, we're so fortunate that we're in a university where we can cultivate our racial awareness by taking courses in ethnic studies, in black studies, in gender studies. We can study a whole host, sociology, history, the humanities broadly, the arts, theater, all of the places that help us make sense of the complex world that we live in. And yet, what does it mean when we turn instead to an advertising engine to do this kind of sense-making in our world? Let's see. Let me just say, I'll wrap us because I feel like we're getting close to time. This is an interesting piece. If you don't want to read the whole book, I know this is different because it's Berkeley. Sometimes my students at UCLA struggle with like reading a whole book chapter. They don't really want to do that. So you can read an excerpt here at Wired. But you know, one of the things that I kind of try to bring to the forefront is that you know, apps and technology are not going to be the kind of answers, and they're not the site of where we should look to solve some of the problems in our society. We now have huge bodies of research. You know, my colleagues here at Berkeley doing some of the most amazing cutting-edge work on machine learning, on the ways in which data sets are used to train AI, the politics and power embedded into these types of structures. And I think we're at a really important moment where we're either going to call back some of these projects, or we're going to think about what it means to have them just developed, let's say in a university lab or in an R&D lab funded by, you know, a VC on Sand Hill Road, and then just deploy it on the public. And you know, I often think about other industries. You know, we have regulation because we know, for example, we don't want three guys to be in a strip mall making some drugs and rolling it out at CVS on Saturday. We know we have a common sense knowledge that we probably don't want to get in a car that was like roughly built from scratch from parts that unknown and put on the road. That might kill ourselves. I mean, if a car is made, like if my husband made a car the way we make IKEA furniture, there's like a lot of parts left over to the side, where he's always telling me how they send extra parts. And I'm like, no, they actually don't. Scandinavian, what are you doing? I mean, it's like perfect. So there's no extra parts. But here we go. If we imagine like that other industries were engaging and then just unleashing these kind of products or services on it, we might think differently about you know, this industry, broadly speaking. We know, for example, now, after the incredible and important reporting by Julia Engwin and Jeff Larson and the team at ProPublica, that the recidivism prediction software, this is the software that predicts how likely are you to commit a crime again, or should you be let out on bail, or should you be kept in prison or in jail, this type of predictive technology. We know that now, after we see the results of African Americans being more than twice as likely to be predicted to commit crime again against their white counterparts, that if ProPublica journalists hadn't gone in and gone through all the records, 15,000 records by hand to see the racial disparity, no one would have known the incredible disparity that was built into recidivism prediction software. And yet, in reality, I heard Jeff Larson, we were on a panel once together at Stanford, and he said the truth was, it was three guys in the strip mall who were making the software. And so, you know, I think these are the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about, incredibly what's at stake. Let me leave us here and just say this. We have more data technology than ever, and we have more social, political, and economic inequality and justice to go with it. We thought, 30 years ago that the internet was going to be a site of liberation. And, people always are like, Safiya, why can't you write the book about algorithms of liberation? And I'm like, I just don't see the mountain of evidence like I see around the algorithms of oppression. In fact, it's funny to me when I'm like on social media and I see people, like they're like, that's algorithmic oppression. And I'm like, okay, that's a phrase we have now. But there was a time when we didn't want to conceptualize that our technologies were anything but neutral tools. And we wanted to believe that the tools that we're engaging with were only imbued with our personal values in the ways in which we use them. But I think now we see that there's a whole host of problems that are emerging. And this really is, if there were anything I would leave you with, I would say this is a great time to be interested in these issues at the intersection of technology and society. I would implore everyone to get the dual degrees in sociology, in history, in art history, in information science, in library science, while you're thinking about computing. Because when we ask different questions that come out of the study of humanity, we actually design and create different types of products and projects. And we also have the ability to forestall and see whether some of these should even exist at all. And I'll leave it there. Thank you. Shall we? Please? All right, let's do it. Am I just scratching the hell out of the floor? Sorry. I feel like this is a new building, and they're going to be like no building and scratch or hardwood.
Thank you, Lori. Okay, we're going to collect note cards from people. So if you have a question you've written down, just hold it up. Someone will come by and collect the note cards. And if you want a note card, a blank note card, just raise your empty hand and somebody will put a blank note card in for you. Thank you so much. Okay. I think we'll just look at each other mostly. Thank you so much. Is this on?
Did you tell them to put nerdier in the front?
You have to use nice handwriting, you guys. If I have to handwrite, it looks like I put the pen on my toes and write it out. So
Oh, that's a good one.
I see that's part of
A
what's happening
little,
here.
like, waking eye at Gail.
I'm just going to start asking, and while you talk, I might look through more questions.
Okay.
Just know that.
If you want me to know that this was your question, you could be like this, so I can look in your direction. Otherwise, I don't facilitate. Okay?
All right. Nadine Strawson has written on the impact of hate speech legislation and how it has negatively impacted the marginalized community that they are intended to protect.
I can't really comment on the nuances of that, but I will say that there certainly is a lot of blowback around hate speech. And when I say that, it's just because I don't know the details of Nadine's work, so I don't want to speak out of turn. I know that there is quite a bit of focus right now about hate speech as kind of a primary driver to talking about things like, for example, content moderation, commercial content moderation. My colleague and collaborator, Sarah Roberts at UCLA, is kind of one of the world's authorities in commercial content moderation, which is actually a term she coined. And there is always, especially in the US, a lot of focus on hate speech. And of course, one of the things that does is it goes in kind of direct opposition or is met with a lot of blowback in relationship to free speech, right, and First Amendment advocates. And so I think that, this is not really new. I mean, I was an undergrad in the 90s, And we have these conversations all the time on college campuses about the limits of speech, for example. And so I would say that to me, the issues are much more structural and deep than just kind of the issues of speech and representation, misrepresentation, because it's, I think about the work of people like Jessie Daniels, who wrote an amazing and very important book called Cyber Racism, where she argues that it's not so much the issue of hate speech per se, it's that hate speech gets more speech. So there isn't really equal speech online. And that makes it very difficult then to engage with or counter. I mean, most of us, I think most professors would say, and researchers and journalists in the US would say, the way you counter hate speech is with more speech, right? That's how, that we're in, struggle over kind of ideas and values. But when you talk about a platform, economic system kind of that is where capitalism and profit are the most important imperatives, then some of the worst content is the most viral, it's the most likely to be seen, and therefore it has maximum exposure, right? It has more speech and more visibility. So I think part of what we want to ask ourselves is like, what does it mean when so much speech is contained inside commercial platforms, commercial advertising platforms, where the value propositions are different than, let's say, the value proposition you might have in a classroom or in a public interest technology space. And that's one of the things that I think is really important to think about.
Okay, we have a lot of questions, and I've made a little question cloud here that is all about what to do, what should be done, what can be done. So I'm just going to read a few of the questions in this grouping. How can we tech students learn, how can we teach students about search engine bias? If you had to make an actionable recommendation to policymakers seeking to remedy these issues, what should the first steps in a regulatory strategy be? What should journalists do about this inherent bias in algorithms? Let's see, how and where can we position ourselves in order to change and make better such complex technical systems? Is it in academia, within tech companies, as journalists? What about those less fortunate in access to education and resources with less voice? I am writing a thesis on how social media companies are implicated in human rights abuses. They bring up Facebook's role in the Myanmar genocide. My question is, how can programmers writing the algorithms receive feedback for how their codes are creating harm? So a kind of whole set of queries about what can I do as an upcoming engineer at Google to help and be educated, graduating senior here.
Good for you. All right, this is great.
Good for you.
Some of your homies need to be here too. Your new homies that you're going to be meeting. All right, okay, so let's get it like kind of broadly, what can we do to kind of teach, or how can we think differently, more broadly, whether we're going into design or we're going into journalism or into industry. So I think one of the things is that what we're doing right now. Okay, I mean, this is a big turnout for this kind of conversation, which means we're in a new moment where you're coming out to hear these conversations and to be engaged in them. And I guess I want to first say that one of the things that I have noticed over the years, since I've been in academia and writing about search and working with students, is that we have a very we have a new level of acculturation that our technology is doing with and to us around kind of an instant answer or a prescriptive answer that can be known quickly and then just implemented. So part of what I want you to do is pull back and think about, I mean, one of the things that I say in the book, and I always say to my students, is all the world's knowledge cannot be known in 0.03 seconds. You guys, we would be out of business. No one would even want to go to Berkeley or UCLA or USC or anywhere. I mean, apparently everyone wants to go to USC right now. That's it. I'm not going back to UCLA because of the headlines. But these issues, we wouldn't desire so much to come to places like this where we can have complex conversations and deep engagement. And otherwise you could just forego getting an education and just go get the answer out of a search engine, right? So one of the things that I think we have to do is resist the idea that there is a prescriptive solution to the complex issues of surveillance capitalism, that every move that we're making is being turned into data that feeds into a system, that new identities for ourselves are emerging based on things like our data profiles. What even is our data profile? I actually heard the director of the FBI once say at a conference, which is weird, I know, that I was in a conference with them, that is, according to the government and the FBI, we are our data profile. They don't actually care anything about who we are. We are where our digital traces are. All the places you've been, all the ways in which you've been datafied, that's actually who you are in the eyes of the state. So, that's something that there isn't like an answer, and then like here just like that, and then we're solved. I mean, these are ways around the way social life and political and economic life is radically shifting. And what I think, we should be thinking about, Shoshana Zuboff has this new book, Surveillance Capitalism, that's a real provocation. I mean, if my book made your stomach hurt, this one's gonna give you a migraine. So read it, okay? Because one of the things that she says is that the new kinds of predictive technologies that we're engaging all the time, whether it's like the Fitbit and how many steps and all of the kinds of ways that we're being tracked, known or unknown to us, are actually creating new ways of seeing the world, which means only particular kinds of opportunities might come to us based on these kinds of profiles and the way in which we are tracking and moving through these systems, which is, for anybody who's in business and marketing, like, that's the ultimate dream, which is to create a consumer that you can manipulate into any type of desire. And I don't know about you guys, but I might have bought this skirt scrolling Instagram because they know I like skirts, you know what I mean? Facebook knows I like it, and then like I get the skirt so.
Until you buy it.
Right,
Yeah.
So the choices that are kind of put before us, and the way in which the loss of agency is starting to happen, this is a moment, I think, to think about the slowing down to find answers, and the closer study of other moments where there have been major radical social transformations, from the rise of the Industrial Revolution to kind of the wholesale kind of data capitalism that we're living under now. And I think these are things that we shouldn't just lightly engage with unconsciously. So those are things that we can do. At a policy level, I mean, I have been involved, to some degree in policy. I mean, one of the things I mostly say to lawmakers is you cannot, on one hand, regulate Facebook and Google and its properties, YouTube and so forth, and simultaneously gut public education, gut public institutions, public higher education, public media, public libraries that serve as the democratic counterweight to the commercial sector, right? And so what's happened is we've seen such a huge shift of resources. I mean, you see, like we shut down all of our servers and moved to Google as the kind of IT backbone.
Yeah.
I mean, when that happened, I had just come to UCLA, and it was like this small department of 14 and like a handful of people around, the UC who were like, no, we can't do this. This matters. So now we're shifting public resources into these platforms and normalizing that as under the auspices of like efficiency, right, and ease and convenience, or that's where the students are, or relating to you as customers rather than partners with us in like thinking about the kinds of world and the kind of values that we want to have. And I think that is the work for us to do. And it's not prescriptive, and it's not going to be a new app that's gonna be the intervention.
It's not gonna be the master's tools?
I don't think so. I know, Audrey. This is why you have to read Audrey Lorde, you guys. So lucky.
I also wonder, because there's so many questions that came up around journalism, you mentioned depletion of public goods, the disinvestment in the public sector, which is definitely happening,
Yes.
especially as megaliths like Google, Amazon, become so normalized as just a way to do any kind of business.
Yes.
That we don't even question competition, what competition? But a lot of these questions were about journalism, and that is another check on
You bet.
power.
You bet.
And that is a business in our country.
Yes.
It's always been a for-profit enterprise. It's not something that taxes ever paid for. But, as journalism has entered into its long waning period from its golden print age, there, of course, is other kinds of journalism rising, like amateur journalism, or blogging, or,
Yeah.
of course, there are still really civic-minded people that are reporting out on what's happening, but I'm just wondering if you see, what you see in the journalism investigative reporting kind of sphere for holding companies accountable.
Well, you know that some of the best reporting that's pulled at the threads of big tech in particular has come from the UK, right? So The Guardian in particular has been really powerful in reporting. Olivia Salmon in particular has done a lot of important work. And I think that investigative journalism, we know, is on it's declining. It's the funding for investigative journalism. Of course, the minute you step outside of the United States and you watch the news in another country, I felt this when I moved to LA, and I was like, wow, is George Clooney and his wife getting married like the opening story on the 6 o'clock news? So, you start to get a kind of sensibility about what the priorities and the kind of shifting interests are in the US relative to other places, and what the appetite is for investigative journalism. For sure, for me, I would put a high premium on investigative journalism, and I would say if you were going to be a journalist, that's the place to be. And I know that those jobs are shrinking. But when I say we need to invest in public media, then I mean we need to invest in public media because we do have public, national public radio, and PBS, and these are really, again, important counterweights, and of course, because they aren't as heavily influenced by kind of the commercial sector, right? So this is an important, I think, dimension of being both a check on state power, but also a way to surface different conversations than maybe what celebrity culture and other kinds of things that are really profitable in our country at this moment. So I think those are things that I would say keep and certainly people like me, we are interested, as much as we call for public interest technologies, we would say the counterweight institutions, public institutions are also really important to that. And I think that, people are also using multiple mediums. So people are filmmakers now, doing really important documentary filmmaking, and it doesn't mean that the commercial networks and services aren't viable places also for investigative work. I think this loss, or this kind of, I was thinking when you were saying we did, this is where it's if you nerd out in library school, you're gonna learn a thing like this. There was a time in the United States before we had the mass collapse of newspapers in the 1990s, but if you go back to the abolitionist kind of era, pre-Civil War, you had the US government, all the way going back to the kind of early colonies, was really interested in the circulation of ideas. The circulation of ideas was crucial to the building of this fledgling project called democracy, right? And this is one of the reasons why we have the subsidized postal mail for bulk mail. The bulk mail it was subsidized by the government, so the politicians, in essence, and other people could get a lot of ideas out and compete in these spaces. And in fact, we had over 200 newspapers at one time and newsletters flourishing in the United States. And it was because of that we were able to create a critical mass around the abolition of slavery. So never underestimate, that these kind of the thread of multiple voices can also be really, really important and valuable. And what I think we're struggling with is the kind of lack of clarity in being able to find some of these ideas, right? And the way in which, in my work, I'm particularly concerned with how search engines broker and make visible certain ideas, increasingly misinformation, and make invisible other ideas. And so those are some of the things we should be thinking about.
Okay, I want to get to this question because I think people are wondering about this. What do you say, they want to hear your responses,
Okay.
What do you say to critics who believe the output of algorithms are simply a reflection of the engagement from users? And then this questioner wrote a quote, like what a critic would say. Google search is a front page of distributed weights based on user interaction and engagement. So that it's just a calculation of whoever is using the search engine. So
Right.
I
answer this question all the time, so it's like the number one question. Okay, so there are a couple of ways to think about this. All right, first, there is a real strong, powerful, I think, mythology in our society that search engines are democratic. So let's start with that they are purely democratic and they just reflect the interests of people. And this is an argument that I really try to break apart in the book. One of the things we know, for example, from other people's research, Matthew Hinman, for example, wrote this important book called The Myth of Digital Democracy. So you know that this has been studied. And one of the things that he showed is that political action committees, for example, have a tremendous amount of influence over which candidates are made visible and how they're characterized versus others. And he shows that it's actually lo and behold money that influences what's visible. Could you believe it? All right, so that's one thing we know, which is that search engines are not strictly a mirror
Right.
of our society. Money.
You can buy your way out of Google.
You can buy your way up, you can buy your way out,
Down, yeah.
right? So we know this. All right, so this commercial dimension is really important. And one of the things I do in the book is I spend some time with AdWords. Like, what is AdWords? What does it mean to be able to optimize content, to pay in a 24/7 live auction to get content connected to the words that are important to you? How much are you willing to pay? Who can pay the most? Well, one of the things we know, for example, is that the porn industry, in the case of girls of color, has more money than girls of color, all right? And let me just say that also, those searches on Black girls, Latina, Asian girls, those aren't girls. Those are women that are that are working in those sites. And so it's just like a fundamental sexism 101, women get coded as girls. All right, so that's just a freebie I wanted to throw in. All right. So this then begs the question of what are these intersecting interests that are happening? So part of it is this political economy of how money moves through these platforms. Part of it has to do with, obviously, the whole gray market of optimization, that people are making a lot of money just figuring out how to game Google, Yahoo, Bing's algorithms and optimize content, and Google's always also having to deal with that. But it also begs the question, what does it mean if you are part of a community that isn't in the majority? Because the way we practice democracy in the US, and of course there are many forms of democracy, but the way we practice it in the US is the majority rules. That's actually never in the best interest of anyone who's in a minoritized group, right?
And the majority doesn't rule when it comes to the popular vote for the president.
Except for then, it really doesn't matter, so.
There's complications.
You got it. So this means then that if democracy is the framework that we're even applying to something like this, no one who is vulnerable, children, women of color, are gonna be people without money, poor people will never be able to use the democratic regime, all right? So this is one of the reasons why you have to peel back this mythology that in fact the search engine is democratic. It's such a more powerful position to think of Google as simply what it is, an advertising engine. If you think of it as an advertising platform, then all these logics make more sense of how this works. And then you can kind of say like, okay, it's great when I want to buy skirts. It's not great when I want to have like a nuanced and complex understanding of how the racist question I just asked it is a mess. It's not going to feed that back to me. It's not going to give you a point counterpoint. It's not going to, in the case of Dylan Rue, when he asks about black online crime, it's not going to say, did you know that the organization, here's a list of hate organizations that use that phrase, and here's some black studies literature, or some, some sociology, or some history.
Or just like the history of the United States of America.
Or like some Howard Zinn, I don't know, anything to just like help you push back on the framing of the question. So this is where we see the limits. I mean, we were talking earlier, I was saying that, the reason why we have so much trust in search engines is because when we're looking for the banal, it gives us the answer. How many ounces are in a gallon, right? We used to in the old days, we didn't even need like the grid or Wi-Fi. We just like went to the front of a cookbook and it was like right there and it took 1 second to get the answer. We were like, what's the password so I can get on your network to get the answer. So, we've shifted our expectations about the banal and its accessibility. And then every time we have the banal type of, fact reinforced, it reinforces our trust in these systems, and that's where then it gets very difficult to understand the limits of the kinds of questions we ask it.
Yeah, I think that you're getting to the predicated and contingent nature of a lot of things that are seen as absolutes in American culture, like democracy or like speech. Like free speech is everyone's right, and democracy means the most wins. But of course, we all know, like, free speech is whose speech? Like, who gets to be free?
Yeah.
And democracy is which majority gets to win all the time.
Right.
So, like, all of these sort of absolute concepts are actually predicated on many other assumptions and power structures.
Also, computer science is an absolute, or like our orientation to math and science is that it's fact and absolute and not subjective.
Yeah.
And then all the rest of us are. And then, we devolve into these conversations about like that the humanities and social sciences are really just a bunch of opinions, right? Not predicated on fact. And so that kind of binary is not helpful either. And of course, if you study, which I do enjoy reading about the history, the philosophical underpinnings of math, which is something that anybody who is doing applied math or CS should be reading. And then you start to understand some of the subjective nature of various ways of knowing the world scientifically.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's also, math is also philosophy. I mean, it's always, I love to tease my coding friends, like my programmer friends, when I'm like, okay, you guys are like so intense about the beauty of your code, right? The beautiful code that they write and like the kind of subjective artistic nature of the code, but then it's like just math. So see, that doesn't go together either, because either it's a programming language, and we know languages are subjective and have inflection, or they're artistic, and they can emphasize certain things and de-emphasize other things, right? Or the language has a limit to concepts that can be expressed. I have this really good friend, he's Turkish, and he's like, at one time his girlfriend was American, and he's like, I just can't argue with her in English because I don't have the right words, and I also can't tell her how much I love her, like if I could speak in my language, So it's like the limits that we run up against are also present in coding, and I think those are the kinds of things I try to explore as well in the book, and say maybe we could loosen up about the kind of absolutism that we have about it so that we have the freedom to reimagine in those spaces.
That's such a beautiful note to end on. So we're gonna end there. I'm so sorry we're out of time. We had so many more interesting questions. I'm gonna give you more of these questions about this person, whoever wrote this. This is really funny, and I'm gonna show it to Dr. Noble privately. It's not to be read out loud, I think.
Oh,
It's
okay.
pretty hilarious.
All right.
And let me just say that I know a bunch of people will want to come up and talk to Dr. Noble one-on-one if you can, so I'll just tell you we're only gonna have about 10 minutes for that, and try to please be respectful and kind as possible as you come up, and don't jostle each other too much. And thank you for coming.